benefit of the doubt. And I know that the Bible says, do not doubt. It says that the man that doubts is, he's tossed on the waves. And so sometimes we think about doubt and we're like, I'm not supposed to do that. And you're right, we're not supposed to doubt. But when those moments come, because that's one of the greatest tools that the enemy puts into our lives is doubt. That's what the Bible calls him the accuser of the brethren. And sometimes that accusation comes by saying, you did this, or you're not doing that. But sometimes that accusation is simply in doubt. He did it with Adam and Eve. The first thing he did was he came to Adam and Eve and said, did God really say that? He didn't say, you have done this, or you shouldn't do that. He just drops this little line out there and said, did God really say? Who's he accusing? He's not accusing you, he's accusing God. Still an accusation. And so there are those moments where sometimes we doubt. Maybe we doubt our faith. Maybe we doubt God. Maybe we doubt the moment. And so I thought about this going into this new year, and I was watching people post on all of the social media about, 2017 was horrible. I sure hope 2018 is better. Or 2017 was okay, but man, I sure hope 2018 is better. And I kept thinking, here's this doubt. Is there a benefit to that? And I began to look at what God told us about those moments where we wonder and when we think about the difficulty that could possibly be in our lives. And so we're doing this little mini-series called Benefit of the Doubt, that when the enemy brings doubt, God brings benefit. When the enemy brings doubt into our lives, God always brings benefit. Sometimes we don't recognize it, and that's what this series is all about, is seeing how do I recognize the benefit that God brings into my life? I have this friend who works for Allstate. He works for Allstate Insurance. He is an insurance adjuster for them here in Kansas. And so I'm always entertained by the Allstate commercials. I just kind of pay a little closer attention to them. I'm always entertained. Especially Mayhem. I love the Mayhem commercials. They're just hilarious. And the guy that does it is he's stone-faced the whole time. But this year, I started out a little confused. Because if you've paid attention, Mayhem was not going to be Mayhem anymore. And I remember that when that first commercial came up and I was like, what? This is the apocalypse. How can this be? Mayhem was not going to be mayhem. And then the truth set in. This week, the commercial came out. Mayhem realized that his resolution to not be Mayhem was really kind of based on your resolutions, and we have already all blown our resolutions just 2 weeks in. And so his point was, if you can't keep a resolution, I'm not keeping a resolution. Mayhem's back. And he's back in force. You know what? That's another great capture of the human predicament. Just when we think everything is going well, just when we think everything is going to be better, we find ourselves in difficulty. We find ourselves in a moment, and doubt may be setting in. We doubt the outcome of a circumstance or a situation. We doubt ourselves and our abilities. We doubt other people. And we may even doubt the opportunity that God is going to work in our lives. So today I want to take another look at how does God provide benefit when all of those doubts arrive? Because again, sometimes the doubt arrives and we have that choice. I can embrace that doubt, or I can see where God is doing something else. I can embrace that doubt and I can run with that doubt and I can live in that moment of doubt, or I can go back and I can look and say, God, what are you doing in this moment? What is the benefit that I can find that counteracts that doubt? Last week we looked at the preparation that God has taught us about in His Word. So many times when the difficulty comes, the doubt hits harder because we're not prepared for difficulty. Even though Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. There's going to be difficulty. But it's so easy, and I'm just as guilty. I am so guilty of it that when the difficulty comes, I'm like, what? Where did this come from? I can't believe this is actually happening. And then God usually goes, are you even listening to me? Do you not remember that I told you that there's going to be things like this that happen? Why were you not prepared? Now, I get it. There are some things that blindside us in life. I get it. There are some things that we just don't prepare for that, they just rise up and punch you in the mouth. I get that. But so many times, there are difficulties that we face that we could have been prepared for, and God even tells us to prepare ourselves for. And we looked at some of these things last week on how God has prepared us. What has He given us? He talked about being humble, because my humility places me out of control and puts the control into a powerful God. If I can walk through life in humility and realize I don't have to do it all, God can do it all, then when difficulty comes, I'm not caught so off guard. It's a place to daily and continually bring our cares. He said, cast all your cares on me. Again, we so many times get blindsided because we're carrying the cares of 6 months. We're carrying the packages that we have built and put together in our lives. And God is saying, you know what? If today you would have got up and just placed all of your cares into my hands, and tomorrow placed a different set of cares because tomorrow's cares are different in my hands, you wouldn't be, it's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. So many times we don't prepare for the difficulty of God because we're carrying the cares of 6 months or 6 years around with us. And so God says, listen, cast those cares on me, prepare for the difficulty. There's an awareness of the enemy. Being aware that there's an enemy out there and being conscious of that and recognize that he has certain schemes. Do you realize that the enemy uses the same thing over and over and over and over and over again? There's nothing really new that the enemy brings to the game. His game plan is always the same. And if we're aware of that and we recognize what those things are, then we're able to deal with it when it comes up. And then the tools of strength and ability to resist the enemy. God has given us tools so that we are able to resist. So that's what we talked about last week is, are you prepared for difficulty? But 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 says this, His divine power has given us everything. Everybody say everything. Okay, now, again, we got to understand what that word means. It means, it's a compound word, and it means every, meaning all. There's nothing left out. There's nothing void. It is every. It covers each and every area of your life. Every. And thing. Anything that is a thing is a thing. I don't know how else to describe a thing. Whatever it is a thing. A page is a thing. A podium is a thing. My shoe is a thing. Everything is a thing. And so God has given us everything. For what? Everything we need, key word there, everything that we need. So that's an empowerment piece. God has empowered my life with everything for life and godliness. So in other words, to live for Him and to live as Him and to live like Him and to operate the way He designed our life to be, He has given it to me, and it's all there. Every tool is in the toolbox. You guys know me really well. This is a pretty stable crowd here. You guys have hung out with me for a while, and you know me pretty well. You may be shocked to know. Now, my dad had a toolbox. when I was growing up. My dad had a toolbox. I can remember it. It was black. It was black, and it was about this big, and it had, you'd lift it up, it's just is metal. It was manly. And it had all these compartments in it, and my dad had all these tools in it. I have a tool bag. Tool bag. It's actually one of those soft-sided coolers is really what it is. and I throw a few things in there, Because you don't want a tool in my hand. And so when I go, when there's something to get done, and we were trying to rearrange. Brendan moved out of our house. He's now in Spring Hill. He's home with Casey, and so he has moved out. So we were getting things put back in our basement that he had invaded for the last 9 months, and so we're getting things put back, and we needed to do something, and so Brooke yells up to Bryson, "Hey, go bring me a screwdriver." So guess where he goes? He goes to the bag. He has to go find in the bag, and there may have been a screwdriver in there. I don't know. But see, that's not how God handles our life. God has given us a toolkit. He's given us everything we need to live a life of godliness. Every tool is there. It's not like I'm going to some secondary source and I've got to hope and plead and wonder, am I going to find the right tool to make it through the day? No, it's all there. It is all there. It is a fully equipped set. Through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and godliness. We're going to expound on that in just a minute. But then he says this, through these, through what? Through his glory, through his godliness. It's not in what I have. It's not in what I bring to the table. It's in what he does. His glory and his goodness. Through those, watch this, he has given his very great and precious promises. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning, is in difficulty. One of the things that we have are the promises of God. One of the benefits that God gives to us are promises. His great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature. See, when we come into these situations where we doubt, when we come into these situations that are difficult, and so many times we try to do it on our own, we need to realize that God has already put a benefit into our life, and it's the promises of God that help us not participate in our own nature, not participate in our own way, but participate the way God has already established it to be. Through the understanding and submission to God's glory. Now again, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about what is God's glory. During the Christmas season, we talked about the glory that was in the sky full of stars. The glory of God is his holiness. The glory of God is his holiness, which makes everything possible and establishes him as the victor in every situation. See, we struggle sometimes with the holiness of God because we see it as the standard that we cannot match. But the holiness of God is what makes everything right. The holiness of God is not something to fear, it's actually something to embrace. Because it's in God's holiness that God makes everything possible, and he establishes himself as the winner in every situation. It's in his holiness. So it's through his glory that these promises, it's through his holiness that these promises, number one, become evident, and number two, become effective. And it's through his goodness. It's through the awareness and the embrace of God's goodness that we have an unaltered access to the kingdom of God, to the unchanging character of God. It's through his goodness. Because of those promises, we can participate the way God designed us to. 1 Peter 5, verse 10 says, "And the God of all grace," the God of all grace. See, there's that word again. There's that everything word again, just in a different form. All. The God of all grace, who called you. So here is a God who has all grace, and he has called you. So he's in relationship with you. Here is a God who has all grace, and he is in relationship with you. With you, not just with me, with you. So we now have a connection between all of God's grace and who that grace is meant to be applied to. Okay? Who called you to his eternal glory, there's that word again, his ability, his holiness in Christ. Now here's the part that there's a comma there. We'd like to put a period there. We'd like to say, the God of all grace really likes me, and he has called me into his glory, period. Let's stop. Let's just stop right there. Because the next line says this, after you have suffered a little while. Oh. Really? Really? Do we have to go there? Yeah. Because after you have suffered a little while, will himself, it's not in what I do, will restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. See, God's desire, even in the difficulty, is to restore you. It is to bring the value that any kind of situation, anything that any person has ever done, any word that's ever been spoken to you that has hurt you. God's design is that after you maybe go through those things, because you understand that you have a toolbox that has everything for God, of God's promises in that toolbox, and maybe after you've gone through that, you can be restored. The value can be brought back into your life. Even the best of preparation sometimes cannot remove the pain and the turmoil that is associated with human difficulty. Like I said, there are going to be times that something's going to rise up and, man, it's going to catch you off guard. And you're going to go, wow, didn't see that happening. I didn't see that coming. But the question then becomes, so how are you going to go through it? How are you going to go through that difficulty? Are you going to go through it doubting God, or are you going to go through it in God's destiny? Our preparation will help us get through it better, but many times preparation will not remove it, as we can see right here in 1 Peter chapter 5. So in the midst of our tough times, God gives us hope. From Peter's communication to those in the body who are struggling, we find some established facts about God's promises. The first is this: God has provision for you. God has provision for you in the time of difficulty. You say, God's got an answer for me? No, I didn't say that. Because a lot of times that's the way we look at it. A difficulty hits and we're like, okay, God, give me X. And God says, no. I have already given you everything. I've already put it in place. I am the God of all grace. See, that's the provision that God brings into our life. The infinite love, the infinite mercy, the infinite favor, the infinite empowerment and goodwill that God has for all of mankind. And he says, I am the God of all grace. And in relationship with us, he desires to make that the provision. Not only does God provide grace, but he distinguishes that he will provide all grace. Every action of God's care, every action of God's concern is applied to us during the times of our difficulty. Again, too many times we look at the difficulty, we have the doubt, and we say, God, if you'll just do this, if you'll provide that, and we shortcut that God has all grace. God has, if this is my toolbox, this is God's toolbox. And so many times I go and I say, God, I need this to happen for this to work. And God says, if you would just let me apply grace into this moment, I'll give all grace. That's his promise. That is his promise. The empowerment to go through the difficulty, even when it is trouble, maybe even that we've brought on ourselves. God says, I am the God of all grace. And he gives it to us, even when we made the reason in itself. Nehemiah 9, verse 30 says, "For many years you were patient with them." Nehemiah is talking about a group of people that he is working with. "By your spirit you admonished them through your prophets, yet they paid no attention. So you handed them over to the neighboring peoples. But watch this. But in your great mercy, you did not put an end to them or abandon them, for you are a gracious God." See, even in those moments, in this situation, Israel had turned its back on God. They decided, you know what? Don't like your plan, really don't like the plan you gave us in the first place, so we're going to change it again, and we're going to do our own thing. And God said, well, here's the deal, guys. It's not going to happen that way, and here's the difficulty you're now going to have to face. But God never just shut the door and said, you're out, you're done. Why? Because he is a God of all grace. And even in those moments, sometimes I get, as a pastor, you get questions a lot on this topic right here. People will say, well, why did God do that? Or the big question is this: well, Pastor, why would God send someone to hell? Why would God send someone to hell? If God is a loving God, why doesn't he put an end to suffering? That's a big one right now. That's a big one that I see in various forms. Why is God allowing people to suffer? Why doesn't God just put an end to suffering? Or why did God do this to me? Well, sometimes, not all the time, I get it, but sometimes suffering is done by our own choice. Sometimes suffering is done by our own choice. We put ourselves in the difficult situation, or we decide to stay in the difficult situation. What more do we really need? Think about it for just a minute. Just let's get, again, this is the frozen chosen. You guys are out here. You guys are committed. So let's talk about this from a really deep level. God says, I have given you all grace. Everything you need to live a life of goodness and godliness, it's in your toolbox. What else do we need? What else do we want? But yet we come to these moments and we say, why isn't God doing something? He already has. He already has. He has made it possible. He's offered his son life for life. But for some, that's not good enough because we still want to live our life our way. And so what happens? God extends his grace. He extends his grace. He extends his mercy. He extends his kindness. He extends his care. Where there really should be judgment, where there really should be punishment, where there really should be penalty, and God says, no, I'm the God of all grace. I'll take it. And still many in the world today, even people that call themselves Christians, live selfishly and they blame God for their suffering. My friend, God is not an author of suffering. He is the God of all grace. That is the promise that we have in those midst. The second promise is this: God has a plan. God has a plan. He says, I'm the God who called you to my eternal glory in Christ. Now again, we read that and we think that's heaven. That's not what it is. In the context, he's not talking about heaven here. He's not saying, I am going to take care of you and I'm just going to usher you into heaven and it's just our little insurance policy. It's our little escape hatch. No, he's talking about in the now, who has called you into his eternal glory. Again, glory is holiness. Holiness is a plan. Holiness is a way of being. The Message says this generous God who has great plans for us in Christ, eternal and glorious plans they are. So the promise, even in difficulty, is God has a plan. Philippians 2 verse 13 says, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. So not only does God have a plan, it's his desire for you, but he is going to do everything in his power to make that plan work. God is going to do everything and act in the way that is right according to his character so that the plan, so that every step happens. You say, well, why doesn't it always happen? because we don't always fall in step. That's why Paul says if we are to live by the Spirit, we must stay in step with the Spirit. Because so many times we may realize, oh, God has a plan. I still have to follow that plan. I still have to know that plan. I still have to go back to him and say, hey, am I in line here? Am I following up here? Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. God knows what they are, and this is what they are. If you're here today and you're going, man, I just don't know what God wants to do in my life. Listen, right now, I'm going to tell you what it is. The details you need to work out with him, but I'm going to tell you what the overall plan is. He says they are plans to prosper you. That doesn't mean make you rich. That means to expand your opportunities. See, a lot of times, and there's certain factions of the Christian world that look at this verse and this is a name it, claim it, bless me, I'm going to have a Cadillac and cars and all kinds of stuff verse. It's not. It's not. He says, my plan is to prosper you. What that means is I'm going to expand your opportunities. So those opportunities may be that, yes, he expands blessing into your life, but he's also going to expand ministry out of your life. To God, that's being prosperous. Not to harm you. Again, this is part of God's plan. God is not waiting for you to mess up. I know that some people think that God is just sitting there. He's just waiting. I'll use this analogy as of what's going on this week. He's got his finger on the button. That's kind of how we see him. That God has got his finger on the button. We're watching our phones, waiting for the text message. We're in launch mode. God's waiting to just blow me up. No, that's not God's plan for you. God's not looking to harm you. But instead, he says, I plan to give you a hope and a future. That is God's plan. You say, okay, Ken, what does that look like for me? I don't know. The details you got to work out with him. The details you've got to begin to search out with him as you go to his word, as you pray, as you hang out with him, as you listen to him, as you let him speak to you through the body of Christ. Those are the details that you're trying to work out. They're all there, but the overall plan is right here in front of you. Everything that I read about God and his planned outcome for my life is good. Everything I read about his outcome for my life is good, even with the suffering involved. It's very easy to dichotomize that and go, but wait, I want the goodness of God, but yet God says you're going to have difficulty. We have to begin to realize in that plan, there is going to be some difficulty. And God is going to use that difficulty, again, to even prosper us in that moment. Last thing is this. This is a promise from God. This is a promise that you can hang on to. Suffering isn't permanent. Suffering is not permanent. When we were at the wedding in North Carolina, we were moving a bunch of glass around. We had taken a bunch of glass vases and stuff to about 100 and some little glass vases, and they had gotten shifted around. They weren't in the right boxes, and so the wedding was over, the reception was over, and I'm already in mode of, when we go anywhere as a family, I'm the one who packs. I don't want anybody else packing. I don't let anybody else pack. I want it packed the way I want it. I shove everything into every inch that I can find. I mean, it is tight. It is going in there, and nothing's coming out until I say so. And so I'm thinking, I got to get all this glass repacked. Well, we had missed some of the crates that the glass was originally packed in, so we had put it just in a box. Mistake number one. And we just put it in a box. Well, I'm getting it out of the car to repack it, and it's in a box that is like this and really narrow, one of those flower boxes, and it's cold. it's not this cold, but it was cold. For North Carolina, it was cold. And so I grabbed the box, and as I turn, and I'm trying to close the door of the van and all of this kind of stuff, and the middle of the box kind of bowed. And my first thought is, I don't want this glass going this way and crashing all over the parking lot. So I shoved my hand under it this way. Well, when I did, I wasn't paying attention, and I stepped forward when I did that, and there was a parking block, and I tripped over it. And so my only thought was, save every piece of glass that you can. And so I'm trying to turn, and this hand's way out here. Whole thing comes down on my hand on the concrete sidewalk. I had about 9 gouges in my hand. And I'm laying there on the concrete, trying not to move because I don't know. I heard glass break, and I'm thinking, okay, if I roll over, am I going to, cut myself more? All this kind of, I'm laying there. This guy comes out of the hotel. He's from North Carolina. He comes out of the hotel, and he goes, "Hey, dude, what happened? You okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I tripped, man. I just broke a bunch of glass." And he goes, "Well, dude, it's really cold out here, and I'm from North Carolina. I got to go." And off he goes. So there I am, and I'm thinking, I'm hurting, and even I'm looking at my hand, and I've got blood running down my arm, and at that moment, you're thinking, this is never going to end. This is, and I'm thinking about all this pain in this moment. You know what? And even now, you probably can't see it from where you are. I've still got scabs and stuff. The other day, I was doing something, and I banged that hand, hit one of those, and I'm thinking, ah! Guess what? It's going to go away. That will soon just become a story that I tell in another sermon. The remembrance of the pain and all of that, guess what? It's going to go away. Now, again, me being the big baby that I am, at that moment, I didn't think so. But we do that with the situations of our life. We think this is never going to end. Suffering is not permanent. You know what? I realized that one of these, after I look at it now, back then, I was trying to be the man. They're coming out and going, "Do we need to go to the hospital? Do you need stitches?" I'm like, "No, I don't need no stinking stitches." That's kind of the way I was, I'm probably going to have a scar on one of these. And I get it. There are things that scar our lives. But the suffering isn't permanent. Even though it's guaranteed, even though it's a part of the sin-broken world that we live in, it's not permanent. Paul says this, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Therefore, we do not lose heart. I'll be really honest with you. Laying on that sidewalk, out there in the cold by myself, I was like, forget this glass. I'm not taking this glass back to Kansas. I'm done. This was the second time I had broken one of those things on this trip. I was ready to quit. Forget this glass. It's not going home. Break all of it, We get that way sometimes, don't we? We lose heart. Something happens in our lives, and we're like, okay, God, I'm done. No. He says, therefore, we do not lose heart. Then he says, why? Though outwardly, we are wasting away. Everything we see on the surface, it's hard. Yet inwardly, we are being renewed day by day. You say, Ken, how does that happen? Remember my first point, that God has resource, that God is the God of all grace, that God said, my desire is to restore you. What this situation has tried to take out of your life, God is saying, I will put something better back into your life. So when everything around us seems to be dissolving, God is bringing it back in value. We are being renewed day by day. because our light and momentary troubles. Now you got to understand, Paul is in a position where Paul has had death threats. He's been stoned. He's been drug out of a city. He's been left for dead. He's been shipwrecked. He's been accused. He's been imprisoned. He's been snake bit. I mean, all of these things. And Paul says, those little blimps on my radar. Now, I got to be really honest. I've never been shipwrecked. I've never been snake bit. Never did a day in jail. I mean, as a kid, I've had people throw rocks at me, but I mean, I've never had an entire city gather around me with large boulders trying to kill me. I've never been chased out of a city. And Paul is going, oh, yeah, that happened. Yeah. One of those things happened 7 times. Just a little thing. Just a light momentary affliction. Though our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Now we're back to point 2. God has a plan. God has a plan. That there's an eternal plan. There's an eternal establishment that God is working on. So did you hear how this is going? He says, listen, even though things are going wrong, even though things are difficult, they're really not as difficult. They may not be as big as you think, because on God's big plan, on God's plan for things, He's got a bigger plan. So what do? We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. What God is doing in our lives that we may not recognize is going to have a lasting impact. Even though we are going through tough times, they are not permanently ongoing. And even though they are there, they are producing great things and the greatness of God in our lives as we realize that we need to keep focused on Him. You say, Ken, how do I do that? You understand these are promises of God. These are not just actions that a preacher is telling you if you'll do this. This is not A plus B equals C. This is not some inspirational speech that I'm going to go out and I'm going to rent out a convention center and sell tickets and tell people, you know what, if you'll buy my book, I'll change your life. No, these are not just steps in a human plan. They are promises of an eternal God. There is a promise to difficulty. I'm going to ask the team to come. James says, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. Blessed is the man who goes through difficulty. Blessed is the man who takes on some of the challenges of life and sees what God can do in them. Because, isn't it cool that God always gives a reason? Isn't it cool? Now, I mean, as a parent, I don't always do that. My kids, I'll say, go clean your room. Why? You know what my answer is? Because. But when God says because, He always has a reason. And He gives us those reasons. He doesn't frustrate me. Because when He has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love Him. When he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. Now again, we're not talking about the context of heaven here. The context of James 1 is not an eternal context. He's actually using a different word for crown here. There are 2 words in the New Testament that are used for crown. One of them is a kingly crown, and most of those are used when it comes to the context of heaven. The other one is an athletic crown. It's what they call a victor's crown. It's the crown that, again, in ancient Greece, that when someone received an award, we didn't give them a blue ribbon. We actually put a crown, a wreath on their head. And it was the victor's crown. It was how you recognized that they were the victor. So when God says to me, because when you have stood the test, I'm going to put a recognition on your life. I'm going to put a mark on your life that says you are a victor. You are a part of my kingdom. When? When you reach heaven? No, now. Now. We were in New York a few years ago as a family. Didn't realize what day it was. We were just there celebrating some things as a family. And all of a sudden, it was really busy in Times Square, and I couldn't figure it out. There was people everywhere, more than usual. And all of a sudden, I began to see people with these huge medallions around their neck. I saw one and saw another one. I saw a group of 5 people, and they all had them. Everywhere I went, we went into a Broadway show, and there were people with these medallions. We went into a restaurant, walking up and down Times Square, people with these huge medallions. And it dawned on me what day it was. The running of the New York Marathon. And all of those participants were there, and they had these medallions. And you knew who had ran in the marathon, and you knew who hadn't. I didn't have a medallion on. So when God says, blessed is the man who perseveres under difficulty. Why? Because after he's done that, in the midst and when that process is over, there's going to be a marker that is put on his life that says, look, he won. She won. She has conquered. In this moment. Today, Brooke and I celebrate 29 years of marriage today. Thank you. But it was a partnership based on 2 things: principles and a promise. God's principles and our promise. I thought about that promise from a traditional vow standpoint. And I realized that when we make promises, the majority of time we make a promise to do something. Even with our kids, just say, clean your room. Okay, I'll do it later. Do you promise? What you're asking them to do is complete the task. You want to promise that there's going to be an action taken. But when God makes a promise, his ability to do is a steadfast result of the promise that is principled in who he is. So when God makes a promise, it's not a promise to do, it's a promise to be. So if you were to go to your kid and say, hey, clean your room, I will. Do you promise? Again, we're asking them to complete a task. But what if we were to asking them to be faithful to their word, to be faithful? See, that's how God is. God doesn't make a promise just so that he will do something for us. All of God's promises are based on the principle of this is who he is, and that can never change. Otherwise, he ceases to be God. Isaiah 40, verse 28. Stand with me today. As we get ready to worship, as we get ready to move into a time of acknowledgement, just what the word says, that we are to seek him, that we are to look to him. I get it. There's difficulty. I get it. There's things going on in your health. There's things going on in your home. There's things going on in relationships. There's things going on in the world. I get it. We don't have to be blindsided today. Jesus told us, hey, Some of this stuff's going to happen. What do I do with it? How do I know it's going to be okay? Because God made you promises. Promises not to just do something for you, but he made promises to be something for you. To be God. To be who he is. To be the God of all grace. To be the God who has a plan. So he asked this question. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God. The creator of the ends of the earth. And he will not grow tired. He will not grow weary. And his understanding, no one can fathom. Can we take a few moments and just focus in on who God is? That verse right there. Have you not realized today, in the midst of the difficulty that is so troubling to you right now, have you not taken a moment and just realized that the everlasting God, the creator of all things, the God of all grace, the God who has a plan, is here. Promises to be who you